We're very glad you're all here with us tonight. You came out in the smoke. Thank you. And I would like to introduce to you Sergeant, is it First Class?
Sergeant First Class Kelly.
Sergeant First Class Kelly from Fort Harrison.
Yes, ma'am.
And he is doing a presentation tonight that he does often in schools. And so if you're really impressed with this program, get information from him so we can go to your children's school as well.
Well, what I'll ask you is just call your general or general of the state and says how impressed you were with this, or because everybody's got it's the new fiscal year and we're all fighting for our jobs. And my job's going to come in September 30th. And a little bit about myself, just recently, quickly, I joined the Marine Corps, went through the Marine Corps, got out of the Marine Corps, came back out to Montana because I love Montana, and then I joined the Montana National Guard. I've been in the Montana National Guard since '93. I put 2 years. I was on orders for 2 years over in Iraq, came back, and it happened to be the bicentennial year for Lewis and Clark. I applied for a job to help the reenactors go across the state of Montana, and they held a spot for me, so when I came back, I picked them up, I met them in North Dakota, and then I helped the reenactors go through Montana, then we handed them off to Idaho and Washington and Oregon, and then we picked them back up on the way back through. During the time frame between that, what they asked us to do was go out and present to the school age or any school that wanted to hear us. So I've been all over the state of Montana, and I've seen probably a good 18,000 plus students in a year. There's another lady, her name is Staff Sergeant Easton. So we've seen a lot of kids, a lot of students, and we cover from, you want to say daycares all the way to college level. And now I can include some of the museums that we've been doing. So anyway, that's what brings me on here. You're going to get a soldier's point of view on the Lewis and Clark tour, or my point of view on the Lewis and Clark tour. And I'd like to introduce over here, if we can get George Juilliard. I either pick George Juilliard or George Shannon, because those two must have really impressed Captain Lewis on the expedition here. George Juilliard was a hunter. He was an interpreter along the way. He was hired from Fort Massac, and then George Shannon was hired in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to come with them, and he had to please Captain Lewis and plus William Clark in order to continue on the expedition. And he went all the way to the Western Ocean, came back, went to Washington D.C. and was presented with Jefferson, and he was there with Big White, and then also he was on the return trip returning Big White back up to the Mandan Indians. So anyway, he was just there's a question up here involving some of these guys. So George, if you want to go over, you can have the seat over there. You can put that big blue hat on. That little ball sits right in front of you. There you go. All right, that looks super. And what you're going to do is help me hand out the items. So if you look down to your right, you should have a haversack down there. Yeah, it's a manly purse, but this is something that George Juilliard would have carried with him. There we go. And then there's another horn down there, right? There you go. You got a powder horn. There is some residue powder that's left in there.
I'm gonna have some fun with this.
So there we go. And then we have one other thing, and like I says, you'll help me hand this stuff out to everybody. When it comes around to you, I left my electronic thing down. I should never do that. Okay, there it is. It's way over there. They're wonderful, but sometimes you just forget about them. So anyway, we'll just continue this presentation. There's a quiz up front. I hope everybody brought their pens and pencils and papers. First question is, and this is by show of hands, is who can name the captain on the expedition? All right, this guy had his hand up first. Yes, sir.
Meriwether Lewis.
Meriwether Lewis. He was the only captain on the expedition. He did write a letter to William Clark, his friend, and his senior officer, when he was in the Army, fell underneath William Clark. But he offered William Clark to be co-captains of the expedition. He was introduced as a captain. He was portrayed as a captain. It took almost 7 years to reveal that he wasn't a captain. Or after President Madison was there, it came out that he was not a captain. He was actually a lieutenant. And the reason for that was that because being in the military, you have to have a position in order to get that rank. And so they found a captain's position for Lewis. They found a lieutenant position in the artillery for William Clark. And that's why he was a lieutenant. Actually, the next question is, does anybody know the president, don't think too far back, that actually made him a captain, that signed his executive order? Yes, ma'am.
Bill Clinton.
It was Bill Clinton, yes, ma'am. All right, so where's my little toys at here? So here's one for you, sir.
Oh, thank you.
And ma'am.
Oh, thank you.
I just make sure I don't step on anything. And by the end of the day, everybody will get something. And then it says, name Thomas Jefferson's personal secretary. All right, there's a couple of hands over here. There's one of you two ladies.
Lewis.
It was Captain Lewis. He was a personal secretary to the President of the United States. And if we look back a little bit more in history, we find out that he actually knew President Jefferson very well. They come from almost the same valley, the same area in Virginia. They grew up together. You can even find family ties together. It goes back to George Washington too. The Lewis and the Meriwether family had been married about 12 different times together. And like it says, Jefferson gets pulled into that too. But Jefferson knew him as a very young man. He knew how good he was. And plus, Lewis wanted to go out on the expedition when Thomas Jefferson was about his third attempt to send someone out there, and he still thought he was too young. But something caught Thomas Jefferson's eye about Meriwether Lewis, and he invited him to be his personal secretary for the President of the United States. Then from Fort Mandan to Camp Fortunate, how many Native Americans did the Corps Discovery meet? And this is from North Dakota, all through Montana, up Great Falls, down to Dillon, Montana. I'd like to know how many. I saw your hand come up first.
0.
0?
Oh, he's
Yes, sir.
borrowing books from me, so he gets
He's borrowing books from, so he's pretty well educated? Yes, sir. Okay. This gentleman says 0. You were so close. But actually, if we go back into the journals, right before they crossed over Lehigh Pass into Idaho, they saw one Native American. And Lewis tried to make friends with him or try to get his attention, spread out his blanket out on the ground, and then showed him what he had to trade. And there was a couple other gentlemen, George Drouillard was one of them, that did not see Captain Lewis or did not see the Native American that was out there, and they frightened him away. He rode over Lehigh Pass, and then the next day they encountered a couple of Native American ladies out there. By this time, the other gentleman went back. And anyway, make a long story short, this is when Lewis actually met up with the Native Americans and then came back over the pass. Camp Fortunate is there today. So we got a little bit more on the history there. Who is the youngest member of the Corps of Discovery? This gentleman.
Captain Lewis or
Oh.
the slave?
Well, I actually said that right up front too, yeah. But Captain Lewis was born August 18th of 1774. William Clark was born August 1st of 1770. So there's a 4-year difference in those two gentlemen.
Lewis?
It was not Captain Lewis. Now you had your hand up, ma'am.
The youngest member?
The youngest
Not
member.
the official one, Pompey, the baby.
Well, Pomp was really never part of the Corps of Discovery, and then he joined the expedition at Fort Mandan, and he left the expedition at Fort Mandan. Yes, sir. Again, Sacagawea came with Pomp, came with Touchant Charbonneau at Fort Mandan. So it wasn't that. Well, we talked about this gentleman a little bit. He was a private, and he pleased Captain Lewis and Lieutenant Clark.
Shannon.
It was George Shannon. Again, he was hired on in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or Elizabeth, Pennsylvania, where Captain Lewis had designed the keelboat, had the keelboat made, and then when he was coming down the Ohio River, again, he hired George Shannon, he hired John Coulter at that time, and and that's why you get George Shannon. Must have been very good at this young of age to impress Captain Lewis to keep him on, and then impress William Clark to keep him on the expedition, or make him a part of the Corps of Discovery. Went all the way to the Western Ocean, then he came back to St. Louis, and then he went into Washington, D.C., then he came back and brought Chief Big White all the way back. And plus, he stayed in the military. He lost a leg during one of the adventures that he was on, and then he became a U.S. Senator, became a lawyer and a U.S. Senator. So he was a very intelligent man. So again, George Shannon is just somebody that kind of sticks out on the Corps of Discovery.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
We lost his leg?
Excuse me?
We lost his leg?
George Shannon lost his leg. You are George Juilliard. you are the fame hunter, an interpreter, a guide. So you were awesome. Lewis thought you were excellent, but George, you got your head on backwards. Okay, there, the big number 1 goes in front. Oh no, that's your little tassel. The number 1, right on your hat. Yeah. There you go. All right, that looks much better. I like that. Well, we know Alexander McKenzie. He was an explorer for England. He was actually a Scottishman. But he is credited for being the first white man to cross the Continental Divide, go to the Western Ocean, and come back. His first attempt, he took a right-hand turn and actually got lost because he ended up in the, in the Arctic Ocean, and then he came back. The second attempt, he actually crossed over the Continental Divide, about 700 yards wide. He figured about 3,000 feet in elevation. So when he wrote his book called Voyages of Montreal, and he put this information in there, it kind of excited Thomas Jefferson. And then Captain Lewis, because he was personal secretary, was getting excited about, wow, there could be this Northwest Passage that people have been talking about for a long time. James Cook was out here looking for it. Robert Gray probably was trying to find it too, but he sailed his vessel in the mouth of the Columbia River, set the longitude and latitude of that river. So Thomas Jefferson at that point knew how wide the continent really was from 1792. So he was really interested when he got a hold of Alexander McKenzie's book, and it told him about what went right, what went wrong on his expedition. So when Lewis actually was getting prepared, he actually had some good, real good intelligence on what to expect coming out here, or maybe what to plan for. So again, we have these 2 captains that were out here, or co-captains. Just to make matters worse, this gentleman said he was not a captain. Captain Lewis was the only captain. But they got paid the same. So everything was equal. Again, if we look back in the military side of the house, they just could not find a slot, and that was Secretary of War Harry Dearborn couldn't find a position for William Clark. How they live in the Army values. Instead of saying the Army values, what I present out here is family values. Again, we go out to the students and we try to bring up the values, the military values that we instill in our young adults that are coming up, or the family values. Up here we got loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage. For loyalty, I think Captain Lewis was a prime example of loyalty. He believed in the United States, he believed in the soldiers, and he really believed in the president. So when the president gave him the executable orders to carry out a mission all the way across the United States to that Western Ocean and come back, I think he was planning that whole trip out, that he was going to make it that Western Ocean, do or die, one way or the other, and then he was going to set the Corps of Discovery up so if they could not make it, if he could not make something happen to him, then the other members could carry on, and that's where the other officer comes into play. And then we got duty. Fulfill your obligation. George Juilliard over here. He was the utmost at doing his duty because Lewis really thought highly of him. If Lewis ever went somewhere, he always took George Juilliard with him. If someone got lost, like George Shannon.
He almost fell off the cliff with his dog.
Excuse me?
Except for the time when he almost fell off the cliff and his dog.
Well, you're talking about Captain Lewis, when he almost fell off the cliff? I never really read where George Juilliard fell off any cliff. Yeah, there's only really good things to hear about George Drouillard. And plus, Captain Lewis wanted to double his pay because he was so good at his duty, at what he did. So for you, sir, you was an awesome hunter, a really good interpreter. You knew one language very well. Do you know what language you knew really good? Wasn't English. They spoke a lot of different languages out here. It wasn't English. It wasn't French. It wasn't Russian. It wasn't Portuguese. It wasn't Spanish. It was something that you probably use every day and don't even realize it. You're talking about animal call, but go back just a little bit more. Something that you would use, that I would use every day to talk to somebody. That just comes natural. This guy has his hand up there. It was sign language that you knew so good. And then you would teach the captains sign language, but you was their interpreter. And then we got integrity. Integrity to do what is right when no one is watching you. So again, these soldiers had the Army values instilled in them, or the family values in them. When Lewis was hiring, he was hiring and looking for these Army values. Plus, he wanted good woodsmen. He wanted good marksmen. He wanted men in good health. He wanted men that weren't married. But there was a couple of them that were married. And for this one, that way they did not feel like they had to leave the expedition at a moment's notice or when they heard that something was wrong and go back home. So there was no real commitment. The whole commitment was again to the core discovery or to go into the Western Ocean and coming back. And the supplies that they took with them. Again, if you just look at what you would take on a camping trip today, even in a motorhome, or if you're a backpacker, almost the same things that we would take today is what Captain Lewis was taking with him on his expedition. Am I in your way?
You're fine.
Okay.
I got it.
So if you just look up there, most of those items you probably find with you somewhere. Maybe not in the quantity that we have, because we got Walmart around. We can stop and buy whatever we need. But he was planning to go to that Western Ocean maybe a year to 18 months. And as soon as he started heading up the Mississippi River, he realized that he was undermanned, that this was going to be a lot longer journey than he ever expected, and that once he got into the St. Louis area, that he's now going to build a fort. He's going to have to train the members up there at Camp Du Bois or Camp Wood River, and then they would follow on the next year going upriver. So if we look up here on the supplies, I want to just point out that if we look down here on the 193 pounds of portable soup, boiled down beef liquefied to a thick paste, egg whites, vegetable. And then it was sealed in lead containers or a lead canister. But they didn't understand about lead, and I just bring up recent history with China and the toys and Mattel that's going on with the lead that's bad for us. They didn't understand that. But Lewis was believing that when he ran into the Rocky Mountains or the Great Plains out here, if there was nothing out here to eat, he was going to have something with them. So again, he brought out the soup with him. This was the most costly item on the expedition. Now some people say the chronometer was, which is a timepiece. It was costly, but not as costly as 193 pounds of portable soup. Now, George, what do you got in your haversack that you was taking with you?
This?
Yes. And this here, because
I believe a plate, a fork, a spoon, maybe.
I don't have a knife in here because I go to schools and I try to abide by the rules. But we do have a plate there. And when we were coming across and we were talking to the elders of the Native American nations that were out here, this is one thing that the Native Americans would have traded highly for, would have been the utensils and the plates that they would have had. But if we would have looked at Sergeant Orway, if George Drouillard or one of the members of the Corps of Discovery would let their plate get rusty or something, he probably would have some extra duty for them to do. So George, if we just hand that to that charming lady there, and we'll pass that on. As it works its way all the way back to somewhere way back there in the background. All right, Doreen, if you can just take charge of that stuff and just put it on that black cart in front of you, and then I'll just make sure I got everything at the end. And then, George, you can take that haversack off and just lay it down on the ground. And I want to see what else you have in your haversack. But they had a looking glass. that they took, or a spy scope that went along with them. Now, for most of us in Montana, we're hunters, or we get a look through binoculars at some birds. Just think if you was a Native American and you was out here in the middle of nowhere, and someone presented this to you or showed you this, well, probably thought it was pretty cool to be able to see something 7 or 8 times as big or as close to than what you are right now. So when the Native Americans got to look through this, they thought it was really something special. And then when it comes around to you, make sure you don't hit anybody. So ladies, it's not time to get equal with the guys. Focus it to your eye by pushing this in or pulling it back out to you. And it didn't have to be pushed way in too hard, just a little bit. And you should see that it focuses to your eye.
Don't know what that is. Handkerchief?
A handkerchief. Well, if you're on the river, and you can work on that there, George. If you're on the river, there's something out there that is really bothersome, that you probably just dread. And there's millions of them. And Lewis was planning that. How about this was an insect net to keep the mosquitoes or the gnats out of your eyes and out of your nose. And this is one of the most bothersome bugs that he would write about. And it's mentioned numerous times in the journal. What else you got there, George?
I've got. I don't remember.
A frog?
Frogs.
George, you're a famed hunter. It's going to take a lot of frogs to fill us up today. And for that, once they got out here, out on the Great Plains, they would run into the bison or the buffalo that was out here, the elk, the moose, the deer, and the men would start using that to eat off of. But there were some nights, some days that the hunters didn't bring back enough. You can leave the electronics in there. That's my backup. Just in case something goes wrong. But anyway, the frog just represents all the other little animals that probably the men on the expedition, since they were all hunters or watermen, that they would have probably captured and ate themselves to make sure that they had enough to eat. And this goes back that they were all in the military, or they were watermen, so they were survivalists, and if they needed to, they would make sure that they had enough to eat. Now, George Shannon got lost for about, 12 days, and the men made fun of him a little bit because he was out here in a land of plenty, and he almost starved to death. But the second time that he got lost, which over by the Big Hole River, back then was called the Wisdom River, that he actually followed the directions that they told him to, and then he realized that the expedition went on about him, but he found the expedition, so he actually, he became a better soldier by getting lost, so now he understood where and how to make the mistake and maybe how to find the expedition. What else you got there?
I think this is like baking.
Well, you're pretty close. How about Voyager's grease? Animal fat. And for this one, if we even go back to the Native Americans, because they'll tell stories about them using the animal fat for their insect repellent, and same with Captain Lewis. What they did with this was they would take it and smear it on their body to keep the bugs from biting them. What I found out is that when you smear it on your body, you become very sticky, so instead of them biting you, they just stick to you. So at the end of the day, you might have 1,000 or more bugs on you, so now you just got to scrape that off. And they didn't really bring a lot of soap with them. So again, this is Voyager's grease. It's animal fat. It smells a lot worse than it does taste. So if you do get it on your fingers, don't wipe it on the person next to you, okay? You can always use the bottom of your pants leg, even though parents don't like to hear that. What do we got? We got a couple of questions here? All right, George. We'll get these questions out here. Meriwether Lewis directed William Clark to find men to employ for the expedition who posed what particular quantities? Intelligence, intimate knowledge of the West, or unmarried?
Unmarried.
Oh, by show of hands.
Unmarried.
Yes, ma'am. Unmarried. I don't think I gave this gentleman a gift, did I? Okay. There you go, ma'am. And sir? And then the next question is, who served as the blacksmith and was punished for misconduct while a member of the Lewis and Clark expedition? Alexander Williard, John Coulter, or Charles Floyd? Yes, sir.
John Coulter.
Oh, it wasn't John Coulter. Who? Alexander Williard. Yes, he got in trouble for getting into the whiskey. John Collins is the one that encouraged him. John Collins got punished a little bit more severe because he was actually on watch. Alexander Willard only got 50 lashes laid on the bare back. So it was Alexander Willard. He was a blacksmith along with John Shields that went out there. And John Shields was the other one that Captain Lewis presented to Congress to actually have his pay doubled because he really thought he needed that expertise or the expedition would have failed.
I'm looking.
Some of the other items that they would have taken with them on the expedition,
Oh, journals.
we got the plant press. Just some of the cards fell out. If you ever remember that when maybe you brought your flowers or something to your parents and they wanted to keep them, they put them in a book or something to press them together in order to keep them for a keepsake and then give them to you later. But as you notice over time, those plants would have changed colors or would have been deformed. So when the scientists would have got the plant press back on the East Coast, the plants would have been deformed. So what Lewis did, and this goes back to Jefferson taught him how to write or helped him encouraged to pick the right words, that he described most of the plants out here very vividly. So when the scientists got to see the plants, they actually got to read and understand what they looked like, what they felt like, where they were growing, what kind of weather it was out here, what kind of soil they grew up in. So that was one of the things that Lewis would bring to the expedition. And again, he was an explorer, and he wanted to find out everything that was out here. And some people really put in that Lewis would bring back so much information that is compared to us going to outer space today. So that's how much information that we got from the Lewis and Clark expedition. And now today, scientists are going back and re-examining the species, the specimens that Lewis brought back, and trying to find out what was the soil like, what was the oxygen in the air like back then too. So it is still relevant to us on the Lewis and Clark expedition. And the cards there are just to show you some of the animals that they were documenting finding. Then we got the 3 presidents that was there with them, or that wasn't with them, but during that time frame. We have George Washington, again, friend of the family, to Lewis. We have John Adams, which was a very good friend to Thomas Jefferson. But towards the end of John Adams' tenure, which Vice President Thomas Jefferson decided to run for office. They had a falling out. They became enemies. And then towards the latter part of their lives, they got back together. They became good friends. And then these 2 gentlemen actually died on the same day within hours of one another. So again, if we go back to Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, we find some ties between them too. What else you got there, George?
Magnifying glass?
A magnifying glass. How about a fire glass?
Okay.
So George, I'm going to really ask you to do something up here. What I want you to do is in sign language, because we can't speak your language, we can't understand you, I would like you to tell us how that works. And then don't look in that little eye thing there.
Does anybody have wood?
Well, this would be how you can start a fire. It would be your little bird's nest. So, well, that's pretty good, George. I really like that. It's kind of hard, right, to try to talk about what you're showing to somebody without being able to speak their language.
More toys.
More toys, yes. So today would be a hard day to show the Native Americans that never seen glass how they made fire out of this. So again, if you're just sign languaging, it would have been hard to explain this. They would write it in on the ground, or again, if it was a nice day, they would show them how it actually worked. And then for our steel and flint, Doreen doesn't want a fire in here, so we ask you, please don't strike the flint on the steel, and then you might miss and hit your knuckles anyway. And then the bird nest or some cotton that you would be carrying with you that you can actually start a fire with. So again, we got flint and steel. This was another way that they would start their fire.
And gunpowder.
We got a compass, a replica compass of what they took with them. Inside here, it doesn't work too good because of the metal that's in the ground and possibly in the walls out here. But you can see that it's trying to find north as we're coming out here. And north should be back behind you.
I don't know what this
Here we go. I'll let you see that one. We got the peace medal. Again, President Jefferson was the president of the time. Every president has a medal made for him. So they brought the President Peace Medal with them. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson didn't see eye to eye, so they brought George Washington's Peace Medal, which was smaller. And they brought one more Peace Medal with them, and that was the silver dollar that went along. So there was actually 3 different sizes of peace medals as they came out. Now for Captain Lewis, because sometimes he came up to the Native Americans and he presented the wrong medal to the wrong chief. He might have missed the orders on which, on the preference of the orders on who demanded the more respect in the native tribes. So that probably caused a little bit of conflict in the Native Americans.
Okay, this isn't like a losing question.
And this would be our quill and ink set. Now it has happened to me that somebody has taken the cork out, spilled ink on them, so I took all the ink out of the bottle. But this would be the quill and ink set that they would use to write in their journals. We know the 2 captains kept journals. Lewis maybe not as good as Clark, or maybe Lewis's journals had just gotten lost. But then there was a couple of the sergeants. They were all ordered that they needed to keep a journal, and then some of the privates kept journals. So when they came back, I believe that they even thought about maybe they could publish their own book on the expedition and tell in their own words of what was going on. And then the journals. This journal here, what I do is I just take it around and I have people sign in if they like the presentation or maybe what went right, what went wrong, and how I can make the presentation better. Yesterday I was in Helena. Sorry there, George. And actually the Kyrgyzstan government was there. They're looking at some medical classes. So I presented this to the Kyrgyzstans, which took a little bit longer than what normally would.
Can I? Do I ask or how do I do that?
And you want to sign that journal, huh?
Yeah.
Well, I'll have to go over and get a pen for you then, sir. Or maybe we're going to have to ask Doreen because I left my pens back there on the table back here. But we'll get you to sign that journal in a minute. All right?
There you go.
The different buttons that the men would be trading later on the trip. For the artillery, it was gold with a cannon. For Captain Lewis and George Drouillard, it was silver with a big number 1 on them. And then as they were coming out, they carried the sextant with them. For anybody that knows, have ever used the sextant, what the sextant really gives you is just an angle. And then you got to be smart enough to be able to go back into the almanac to find out what part of the hemisphere you're in and what stars are above you at a given time. So again, the sextant really just gives you an angle. If you want to find out how it does work, you're going to hold it in your right hand. There's a little handle here. You're going to look through the looking glass on there at something, and then you take the mirror and pivot it until you can actually see it in the mirror to where they join up, and then you can read the angle from it. So if you look at something on the wall, you can actually look on there and then take your little mirror and try to find out what angle you are from that object. And again, they used the animals that were out here for their clothing. So they were coming up to Fort Mandan, the men were already making their own clothing. For First Sergeant Norway, this was a military expedition the whole way. He made sure everybody dressed the same, looked the same, and he was the only one on the expedition that actually signed his journal or wrote in his journal every single day. Again, if you understand the military way of life, the first sergeant is the one that knows where everybody's at, who's doing what, where, when, and how, and why. So again, Sergeant Orway was the one that actually signed his journal every single day. And then this trivia question up here. Were all the expedition members human? No. This one's kind of give me.
Lewis's dog.
Lewis's dog.
I think it's
I heard it out here. Someone said it. His name was Seaman, yes. And he was a big Newfoundland. Some people put him, estimate his pounds as 120 to 150 pound dog. And Newfoundlands love water. There was 3 of them that actually went on the Corps Discovery out here. They rotated them in and out. Most, what they were finding out, that the dogs would become overheated or dehydrated on the expedition, and they'd become a little mean. So they had to rotate these dogs out. So if we look back at the expedition during that time frame, Seaman didn't have that luxury of switching out with the other dogs, and he probably fell ill to the same symptoms that affected the men on the expedition: malaria and dysentery, because of the river that they were traveling on and the pollution that was even coming down back then. We have a map of the United States. To me, Lewis knew his whole route. He knew where he was starting from because he was working for the President of the United States. So he was going to start over here in Washington, D.C. And then he was given the order to go to Harper's Ferry and acquire whatever materials he needed. And then we know that the people at Harper's Ferry was told to make sure Lewis got what he needed in a very timely manner. From Harper's Ferry, he would go over to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Elizabeth, Pennsylvania, and he would make sure that the keelboat was made. The person that was making the keelboat, well, he liked his alcohol or his spirits a little bit too much, and he drug it on too long. So on August 30th, of 1803, that's when Lewis finally left. A little later in the year than he wanted to. The Ohio River was one of the lowest times in the history of the Ohio River. So he was coming downriver. He kept on running aground. So he needed to buy 2 other boats, and this is where the pirogues came in. So we had the keelboat and then the 2 pirogues. From Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, he followed the Ohio River down to the Mississippi. From the Mississippi, he came up here to St. Louis. St. Louis, he spent the winter of 1803 to 1804. Plus, he needed to hire more men. If we look back in the history of the United States, usually they gave orders to the captains or to the lieutenants to go to a certain area and then hire the militia that was in that area to fill your ranks. He wasn't given a platoon. He wasn't given a company to come out here. So when he got out to the area, then he had to hire the people in order to fill his ranks. And that's where the men of the expedition comes from. So most people think the expedition started in St. Louis, went to the Western Ocean, and came back. If we look at Captain Lewis, we know he left July 4th of 1803 from Washington, D.C., and that's when he started his expedition. And then he had to return all the way back and then give a briefing to the President of the United States of what he saw out here. What did he feel? What was going on out here? From St. Louis, we know that he went on up the Missouri River out to Montana, crossed over the divide, and then hopefully once he got out there at the divide, wherever that was, he was going to get on this river and float all the way to the Western Ocean. Because if we look back at Alexander McKenzie, he wrote about his expedition. It was only 700 yards from one mouth to the other mouth. What he forgot to say was that they were impassable. So people thought, wow, this is kind of different, you know. When Lewis got out here, and he crossed the Bitterroot Mountains, almost starved to death. We can go back and look that he used his candles, or they ate their candles. They ate some of the horses that was with them, some of the dogs that came out. But again, that animal fat that you have out there, the voyager's grease, would become their candles, plus it would become their savior as they crossed the Bitterroot Mountains because they ate the animal fat or their candles. Then he would get on the other rivers that were over here, notably the Snake River that leads into the Columbia River, and then go all the way to the mouth of the Columbia. He knew where the mouth of the Columbia River was because he had the longitude and latitude of that river. So he knew where he was going. He knew his whole route. As he was coming back out here, we know at Traveler's Rest that the 2 officers decided to split. Probably a little bit unheard of for most people out here in the middle of nowhere. Without instant communications, they didn't have no cell phones, they didn't have no radios, and they split at Traveler's Rest. We know that Lewis would follow the road to Buffalo, over to the Great Falls. Clark would go back to Camp Fortunate over by Lehigh Pass, refloat his canoes, First Sergeant Norway would take a group of men and follow the Jefferson River all the way back to the Missouri to the Great Falls and continue the porting around the Great Falls. Clark would head east and he would go over the Bozeman Pass. From the Bozeman Pass over Livingston area, he ran into the Yellowstone River. They knew about the Yellowstone River over at Fort Mandan. They were even told about this river, that it could probably save them some time. But again, if we look back at the executive order from President Jefferson to Captain Lewis, he specifically stated that you will follow the Missouri River to its headwaters. So maybe that is why Captain Lewis chose to follow the Missouri River and not go on the Yellowstone. Or maybe they had a plan when they were coming back that they were already going to split up. And Clark was going to be doing his own investigation on the Yellowstone River. During the trip on the Yellowstone River, he would send Sergeant Nathan Pryor with the horses to go across land to Fort Mandan. Now, if we look at a map of present-day Montana and North Dakota out there where Fort Mandan is, Knife River, the confluence of those two rivers, of Missouri and the Knife River, we see that it's almost a straight line from Billings, Montana, over to Fort Mandan. Actually, Nathan Pryor would have arrived sooner than Clark or Lewis at that fort. And he would have been able to give the horses to the Native Americans there, to the Mandans. If they weren't there, he was supposed to go up north and actually give them to the British. Well, we know that the Native Americans that were out here, the Crow, decided a little differently. They decided to borrow the horses themselves. Nathan Pryor came back to the Yellowstone River. He saw how they made the bow boats a year before. He made the bow boats. He started floating down the Missouri River, caught up to Clark, and then Lewis, coming over to the gates or to the Great Falls of Montana, split again. Again, he wanted to find the most northern waterway, and he thought the Marias River was that. So again, at Great Falls, he would drop off a group of men that would continue the portaging around the Great Falls. Him, the two Phil brothers, and George Drouillard, you'd go further north in order to investigate the two Medicine Rivers, what we now call the Marias River and the Sun River. That's up there. And then Lewis would come back. Now at this point, this was really the first conflict where somebody got killed in Montana or in this region out here. So really the first military action took place all the way back in Lewis and Clark in the Montana Territory. And we know that two Native Americans lost their lives, but they were trying to steal the horses that was going on. And if we read what took place there, they were warned not to, they were given verbal warnings, and maybe some overreaction that was taking place. But we know that Lewis would mount the horses that he finally got from there. He would ride over 100 miles during the evening hours, and then consequences happened there that he would show up at the Missouri River the same time as First Sergeant Orway had already portaged around the Great Falls and was bringing the white pirogue back. Just by consequences, it was the same time frame again. And he would get on the white pirogue, and they would set sail down the Missouri River. As they came back down to where we call the Montana and North Dakota border, they would run into William Clark, almost 3 days apart. What an amazing trip that was with the distance that was involved, with no communication whatsoever, and they were able still to meet up with one another. The keel boat. This boat was designed from St. Louis to go all the way to Fort Mandan. From Fort Mandan, they were going to load the keel boat up with all the specimens, the hides, the furs that were out here, and then send them back down to St. Louis, to Washington, D.C., to show the scientists, to show the president, to show the people what was really out here. He even tried to talk a couple of the Native Americans to come out here with him, to go back to Washington, D.C. The keel boat was 55 feet long, 8 feet wide, loads of tons of supplies. And the way the men got them upriver, they got them upriver by oaring them upriver. 20 sets of oars were on this boat. The red pirogue had 7 sets. The white pirogue had six sets of oars as they were coming upriver. The red pirogue only made it as far as the Marias River. That was the first cache that the expedition was actually putting. So Lewis, again, was planning almost a year in advance of what was going to take place. And then the white pirogue would go all the way to Fort Benton. Because if we go a little bit above Fort Benton, we'll see that there actually are some rock ledges in the water that prevents any other boats from going upriver from Fort Benton on. They would use the big long poles, either to push that boat upriver or to try to steer it around the objects coming down the river. Again, this was during the spring season of the Missouri River. Big trees were floating downriver and ramming into the boats. The people didn't want that to happen. So in order to avoid sinking the boat or maybe running aground, they would use these big long poles to try to push that keelboat around them or the objects around the boat itself. And the same thing with the white and red pirogues. And last, or not last, but anyway, what they would do, they would tie a rope to the keelboat. And they would have to, what they would call, cordell the boat upriver. And this is how it happened most of the time. So there was a rope tied to the front of the boat. They would put it over their shoulders, and the men would pull it upriver. Instead of coming straight upriver, they had to zigzag back and forth across the river, across that current of the Missouri River, in order to get these large vessels up the river. So now if you just think about the springtime, about all that mud, all the silt that was coming down river, the animals that had drowned during the winter that was coming down river, the huge trees that were coming down river, the obstacles that these men had to overcome to get these huge boats upriver. And on a couple occasions, they write in their journals on how nice it is to sail upriver, at about 3 knots that they're able to sail upriver. Lewis even writes in his journal, when he was back in Pittsburgh to Lancaster, he took a stagecoach, one of the first gravel roads in the United States. And he was amazed at the speed that he can travel, 5 to 7 miles an hour. But Lewis's real job was to come out here and just see what was out here, to write down what was he feeling that day. What was the weather like? What were the people like? What kind of language did they speak? How did they treat their people? How many of them were out here? What kind of animals were out here? Jefferson was understanding there was still dinosaurs out here. We know that wasn't true, but he thought the woolly mammoth was still out here. The giant ground sloth still roamed the grounds. There was even entries that there was a 7-foot-long beaver that was out here. There was never a 7-foot-long beaver out here. That there might have been a mountain of salt 1 mile long out here. So again, they didn't understand what was out here. What I find that was very interesting, very funny, was that the people that were making maps of this area, they didn't consult the people that lived out here. They just made maps on what they thought was out here. All the rumors that they were hearing. All the waters, the rivers that flow from out here come from one source. The Colorado, the Platte River, the Kansas River, the Yellowstone, the Missouri, all come from one source. So they didn't really understand what was going on. Clark, again, was brought on board the expedition to be the map maker of the expedition. He took it upon himself to make his own map, because all he had to do really was to write down the longitude and latitude of known features that were out here, key terrain, or maybe where the 2 rivers intersected, or a stream comes in. And that's all he was supposed to do. He took it upon himself to make his own map. And then, while he was out here, he talked to the Native Americans to perfect his map and to get their point of view to understand really how this land really was out here. And again, it goes back, if you look at Clark's map, when he was coming down the Yellowstone and he sent Nathan Pryor out across the prairie, he understood that Nathan Pryor could take those horses faster across the prairie, get to Fort Mandan, be able to present the Native American chiefs these horses before they would get down there on the river alone. So again, the maps were very vital of what was out here. All the information that they brought back, the animals that were out here. Clark, he really liked the jackrabbit. He was amazed by this animal, how big it really was, how fast it could run. He even took time to measure its leaps or its bounds. And he would note that it would bound 15 to 20 feet during a run. And he would be able to cut on a dime. The antelope that was out here, or the prairie goat that they found. The Native Americans used this animal more of how to work together, because it took them to work together in order to capture this animal, because it was so fast out here. And then somebody had to clean up the kitchen that was out here. So we have the wolves, the prairie wolf. Today we refer to it as the coyote. And then the buffalo that fed many nations out here. But if we look back at the Native Americans, they used this animal to document a lot of history. They would use the hide of it to write down, or not write, but to draw pictures of what was taking place in their life, the conflicts that they had, the different nations, the maps of the area. And yes, they even wrote them on the rock walls, but it was usually the back of the animal or the animal hide that they would use. And then it was their home. It was their food. It was their plates. It was their silverware. The buffalo stood a lot for the Native Americans that were out here. The Native American tribes, depends on how you want to count them up, 57 to 58 different Indian nations, all the way across from St. Louis to the Western Ocean that was out here. But George, I imagine that you had a very difficult time during some of those little powwows to get together around the campfire, and how would you communicate to one another? The different games that they played. Because Lewis spent some time with some of the Native American nations out here to learn their language, to learn what they really meant out here, or maybe to find out who their enemies were and who their friends were, and see if they could become, or persuaded, become friends of the United States. Because now Lewis had to tell them that they now own, their nation has now become part of the United States, and their great father is President Jefferson. It would just be a little complicated. Sacagawea, again, this is a little complicated story. If we go to North Dakota, we find out that she was Hidatsa. They believe that she came from their nation. If we look more into the story, we know that the Hidatsas came out here to the Shoshones, out to the Montana area, and they captured her, brought her back as a slave. She was traded to Touchant Charbonneau, or won in a card game. So to me, she was a slave to Touchant Charbonneau. Touchant Charbonneau wasn't really well liked. He almost overturned the pirogues a couple of times. He didn't want to do his job. But Lewis, in order to get Sacagawea to come out there, or if you're from the eastern side, you'd say Sacagawea, in order to get her, he had to hire Touchant Charbonneau to come on out. And he felt that he really needed this young lady as an interpreter when he got out to the Shoshones, because the Mandans were telling him that the Shoshones, the Snake people, have many horses. And he was understanding that he needed the horses in order to cross the Bitterroot Mountains. But this was another myth, that Jefferson believed that the Appalachian Mountains was the highest point on the U.S. continent. And when Captain Lewis came back and says, hey, you got to check out these Rocky Mountains, now the map makers had another story to make. And again, it goes back to William Clark was supposed to bring all that knowledge, hand it to the War Department, and the people on the East Coast that never even been out here was going to make a map of this area. So again, William Clark took it upon himself to make that map. We know that John Baptiste Charbonneau would come on to the expedition at this time. He was a very young lad at this time. Most people called him Pomp. The first person that I found documented calling him Pomp was Clark. And again, if we go back to the slavery time frames of how he treated his slaves, or what they call the firstborn, was Pomp. It was just natural. And then I bring up York, that was on the expedition with him. We know that Lewis would take a friend with him, a trusted companion, which was Seaman. Clark told his trusted companion that he had to go along with him, and that was York, his slave. Once they left St. Louis and went to the Western Ocean and back, York was treated equally. He was given full rights. He was a hunter. He was a boatsman. He was able to do all the work that the other people were. So the relationships between the men and York really grew. But now when they came back in the United States, now the relationship either has to end or they have to be secret about it, because York is African American and he has to be treated as a slave again. So we got to go back and look at the different personal conflicts that were taking place that was out here too. And we got the personal courage to stand up to what you did not know that was out here. The Native Americans talked about these guys that were out here. The great white bears that were out here. They haven't run into any grizzly bears. They've seen them. They haven't run into any until the first grizzly bear was actually killed in Bainesville, Montana. Is where they were actually killed at, or the first grizzly bear was killed. Now what I brought along was just a casting of a grizzly bear, and then I added black bear, which is a cinnamon bear, but the same species of bear. And there's a size difference of those two bears. They were huge. Ah! So just have the personal courage to stand up to this guy. And if you're hunters, in order to find how tall this bear is, what you do is measure the width of it and then add 2 inches to it. So this is about 9 inches across. You add 2 inches, 2.5 inches. That tells me that this bear is going to be between 10 and 13 feet tall when it actually stands up on its hind legs here. So from there all the way up, that would have been a huge bear. So I don't know if I would want to run into him, but Lewis writes into his journals that he would rather fight a Native American than ever have another bear encounter again. And he thought that he had his arsenal, the black powder rifles, his air rifle would be able to take these animals down. And he found out differently. There was some that was killed on the first shot, but most of them took about 7 to 9 shots. And the grizzly bear chased some of them into the water in order for them to get away from him. But he was huge out here. But he was the cleaner of the kitchen. He could eat anything out here he wanted. He was the big guy on the block. And the real reason to come out here was to find what animals were out here. Mainly, what was the quantity and quality of the beavers that were out here. If you was anybody of importance back then, you would be wearing a beaver pelt hat. Maybe what Jefferson was thinking, that maybe we can get the beaver pelts back into the United States. We can manufacture them better and cheaper and then sell them to the British. Or maybe we can start trading with India and starting that Asia trade that was going on. And this is how Jefferson was going to pay for this land that he purchased out here. But we got some of the other animals that they ran into. There's some up here in front, so after the end of the expedition, if you want to come out and look at them, you can come and look at them. We got a mountain lion out here. We got a buffalo. I've been told that this was either a 5 or a 10 pelt blanket, and what that means, they would trade either 5 or 10 beaver pelts for that blanket that was out here. That was back then. Then the Rocky Mountains that were out here. Again, Lewis was not anticipating these mountains that were out here, but he started seeing them as he was coming from Fort Mandan across Montana, and they already had snow caps all through summer back then. So I imagine that he knew that this was going to be his obstacle to get across. But once he crossed the Continental Divide, he was hoping to find the Columbia River and sailing all the way to that Western Ocean. And that didn't happen. He ran into the Nez Perce. They were almost dead at that point. The Nez Perce nursed them back to life and actually gave them some more horses and continued on their expedition to the Western Ocean. But the different animals, that was throughout the trip that they came out here. The different areas that they ran into. All the way to that Western Ocean, Fort Clatsop. They had to spend a nice cold winter out there. If anybody's been out to Fort Clatsop, or maybe you know the story, you know that last year Fort Clatsop actually burnt down. And then they rebuilt Fort Clatsop back to the same spot again. But Fort Clatsop, if we probably double the size of this room, that was how big Fort Clatsop was. It was very miserable out there. It was cold. They were wet. He just did not like it. There was not a lot of food. George Juilliard, you did the best to feed them, but sometimes you couldn't bring them back enough, or the meat just rotted. And what we're going to do there is we're going to end it right there. I don't know what time it is. Doreen, if you know the time? 8 o'clock. All right. So what we can do is open it up some questions. And then, like I said, no one's not going to leave here without something, and I got something for you. But George, let's give George a big hand. Yes, George.
Who was that one hunter that...
Pierre Cruisant was brought on the expedition because he was a very good boatsman. He was a good fiddle player, so his entertainment, and then he was a cook. But for a hunter, I don't know. But yes, Captain Lewis got shot in the buttocks by Pierre Cruisant.
I thought you guys got it in the upper thigh.
It could have been the upper thigh, but it was in the buttocks. He finished the expedition laying on his stomach. But still at that time, he still was discovering new plants and still writing little essays about what he was finding out. What I have here is I got a bracelet for anybody that would like one. I'm just going to pass the bag out. And as the bag comes around, if you would like to take a bracelet, if you want one or two, feel free. Is there any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Does anybody know what happened to the dog? Seaman disappeared on the way back? Nobody knows.
In the journals, oh no, they know. You just got to follow the journals. But Seaman actually goes all the way back to President Jefferson. He's not mentioned much because if we notice at the time that he's taken out of, or you don't really hear him, again, it's that conflict with the Blackfeet Indians. And they're moving really super fast. They get on that white pirogue, and everything's happening very quickly at that point. So Seaman is not a real big part. He's just probably sitting in the white pirogue going down river. But if you follow the expedition and get back in the journals, you find out that he actually goes all the way back to Washington, D.C. So he is one of the, and that is one of my questions, is who are the three members that made the whole trip? And that would have been Captain Lewis, George Shannon, and then Seaman the Doug. We know that John Coulter, because John Coulter was brought up, John Coulter was the only one of the expedition that was voted to lead the expedition or allowed to lead the expedition by his fellow soldiers. And he would lead the expedition at Fort Mandan. He would hook up with Hancock and Dickinson, come back out here to the western part of the United States, and he become into the fur trading business. He's also recognizing of finding Coulter's Hell. Some people say Yellowstone, some people say not. I'm not a historian to really pinpoint that, but he did document that he did, was able to witness some geysers. So I hope I answered that question about Seaman the Doug. And then John Coulter wouldn't have been, if he would have stayed on there, he would have went that whole expedition way too. Yes, ma'am.
Where did Sacagawea finally leave? How long did she stay with?
Okay, Sacagawea would join at Fort Mandan. Right. She would go to the Western Ocean. She would come all the way back to Fort Mandan. Because if we look back again on how they were hired, the soldiers were usually hired for 6 months to a year at a time. The officers can leave at any time. So these men, the soldiers of the expedition, they were hired to go to the Western Ocean and come back to St. Louis. Sacagawea, Touchant Charbonneau was hired from Fort Mandan to go to the Western Ocean, come back to Fort Mandan. He was released. He actually wanted to stay on, but Lewis says, no, we don't need your service anymore, and he was allowed to leave at that point. Did that answer your question, ma'am?
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Did he want to leave?
Did Touchant Charbonneau want to leave? No, he didn't. He was a fur trader, but I think that he found out that being in the military, being a private, that he was making some good money at the time, and he actually documented that he wanted to go to St. Louis, but he was allowed to leave the expedition, or he was excused from the expedition because he fulfilled his commitment to the military at that time frame. Now we know that Clark would come back and ask Sacagawea if he could take John Baptiste Charbonneau on as his own. And she would say no the first time. The second time, she said yes. And then Clark would actually educate Touchant Charbonneau to be a very well-educated man in the United States, as well as sending him overseas. And then he came back and is part of history, mainly the California-Oregon history. Yes, sir.
Where's Sacagawea buried?
That's a question of how you want to interpret history. All right, for me, I really think that she actually came back and lived with her people, and she lived to be at quite old age. So she is buried somewhere out here, is what I believe. But don't quote me.
Wind River Group, is that the one you think?
Yes, sir. Don't quote me on that one. But yeah, that is up to you to get into the history books, and that goes back to Lewis. Did Lewis commit suicide, or was he actually murdered? Was there a plot to kill him? Again, I believe that actually Lewis probably did commit suicide. Clark believed it. Jefferson believed it. His two close friends thought that, yes, that is how he died. So, again, you got to get into your own history books and believe what you want to believe, sir. Yes, sir.
What became of Pomp?
Pomp? Well, John Baptiste came back to live with Clark, and then he was again educated in the United States and sent overseas to be educated. And then he came back out west. From there, we can track him into Santa Fe, into Fort Benton over in Colorado, out to California, and then he's in California in the Gold Rush area and coming back. When he came back to the Oregon, because he was coming back to his people, that's when he actually died. So he died somewhere in the Oregon Territory. Actually, if you go over by Reno, you'll find where his gravesite is, and that's where he died. But he was headed back to his people.
Does anybody know how old he was?
They believe that he was about 56 years of age. I can find that information out and give you exact knowledge on that. But I think approximately would be about 56 years of age. And that was old back then. If we look at the oldest man on the expedition, this was the gentleman that actually replaced Charles Floyd. Charles Floyd was the only one to die on the expedition. They would go over 8,000 miles, and Charles Floyd died of natural causes. If they get back into the journals, they read how Lewis documented how Floyd became ill, the sudden onset of it, where it was at, how he treated it, how it didn't have no effect on him, that now the doctors think it was appendicitis attack, and Lewis, or the known doctors, Dr. Benjamin Rush, could not have done anything to him at that point. Charles Floyd just was going to die no matter where he was at. The men voted that private gas would replace him, so the men voted private gas to be sergeant gas. And then he volunteered to be in the Civil War, and he would live to be in his 90s. And he actually settled down when he was 60 years of age, and he started having kids at that point. So he was a man back then. Yes, sir.
Lewis and Clark were separated at times, and then they would hook up back together. How were they able to do that?
Well, I bring that up. I mean, back then they did not have instant communications like our cell phones now or our radios. They did split 5 different times, their groups. But again, if we look at how Clark was making his map, how they understood the area, they went back, they referred to those maps. Clark was very good at making the maps. And so they came back to those maps and they understood the flow of everything, how it happened. So if we look at the flow of it, we can understand how they actually split up. So George, I'm going to need you up here for a minute. And Dory, is this all right to go a little longer? Okay. Let me turn this off for a minute. I hope that we all got it here. Can you hold that up there, George? Try not to cover your face. We got to step back here so everybody can see it. Is that going to put a lot of glare on it, or so we can see it all? Well, I would try, but I had to get George up on his stool. Oh, there we go, George. That's a great job. Okay, so if we look over here, we know that he would start in Washington, D.C., and then how he came along the Ohio River to the Mississippi River. Once he started going up the Mississippi River, again, he knew that he needed extra hands to get these massive boats up the river, up the Missouri River. At St. Louis, he's going to spend the winter of 1803, 1804 to educate his troops on what is expected of them, and then plus get prepared to actually go on this full journey all the way to the Western Ocean. As he came back from the Western Ocean, this is where Clark was making his maps. He didn't have to spend the time to make the maps to do all the reading, so it was a lot quicker coming back at Traveler's Rest. And again, there's only 2 places so far that is really known where Lewis and Clark actually was. There's only one place that the evidence is really there, and that's in the state of Montana.
I think he carved his name into it.
It is Pompey's Pillar. Back then they referred to it as Pompey's Tower or Pomp's Tower, but that is where we can actually see evidence where he was. We know that Traveler's Rest was actually documented, that Lewis and Clark was here by the archaeological finds that they found there. So now where Traveler's Rest is today is where Lewis and Clark was back then. That's where they came up with this plan, or maybe a year before, they came up with this plan of splitting 5 different times up here. And this map here will show you a little bit better. You can see it a little bit better on one hand out here. But at Traveler's Rest, Lewis would take off, and he is going to go now east, but he's going to go from here to the road to the Buffalo. And if you follow I-90, it follows the road to the Buffalo, and then at Clinton you got to take a left and head on over towards Lincoln area, and then over to the Great Falls. He follows the Dearborn River, where the Dearborn River and the Missouri River actually runs in together. That's where Lewis was the same time the year before as he was in 1806. So again, that was in Montana. Clark wasn't there that year, but Lewis was. And then they went on into Great Falls, started the portaging around Great Falls. Clark, on the other hand, went from Traveler's Rest and went towards Gibson's Pass. Instead of going over the pass, he took off over by Wisdom and came up the valley there over to Camp Fortunate. Because by his map, he knew where he was at, what path was going to be more easy for him to get. At Camp Fortunate, they refloated the canoes that they brought upriver, and the way they sunk them was, if we understood how they made a dugout, they would take a cottonwood tree and they would start digging it out. As they were hollowing it out, they drilled a hole in the bottom of the canoe so they can tell how deep that canoe was or how thick it was. And then once they got the canoe built, they filled that hole back in. So they just opened up the canoe and sank them down in the ground. Then we know that First Sergeant Arway would take a group of men, and they would take those canoes back to Great Falls, to portage around the Great Falls. Clark would go over towards the Bozeman Hill, and he would be headed east at that time. He runs into the Yellowstone River at Livingston today, and he couldn't find cottonwoods big enough in order to make canoes there. So he took his horses all the way down to Columbus, Montana. And during that trip, he actually comes up with a plan, because the horses started becoming lame. And he started saying, well, let's put some moccasins on the horses, or let's cover their hoofs with some leather. And the horses actually, it worked for him, because the horses now started feeling better and they were able to carry a little bit more weight. Then at Columbus and Billings area, he would send Sergeant Pryor off to go across the prairie to Fort Mandan. And the idea was to get there before the expedition got there, hand to the chief of the Mandans the horses over to say, hey, we're coming and we want your help again. If he wasn't able to make up to the Fort Mandan, he was supposed to go up into the British area up north and actually try to persuade some traders up there in order to help the United States out. So yeah, it was they split 5 different times. It seems to just kind of work together with one another, that they all met up almost at the same time, because Sergeant Pryor came back, he built those bull boats, and he was able to catch up to Clark, and then Lewis was only 3 days behind them. So it really is amazing that everything kind of fell in together, because once Lewis got to the portage, he split again and he went north. He took 3 people north. So your pants are falling down, huh, George? So I hope I explained that a little bit to you on what was going on. Like I said, the map I give you will draw that out, and I hope I answered your question, sir.
When you did the reenactment in the Montana Territory, were you in period dress and period bureaus and things like that?
When they came through here, yes. My job, again, I was getting paid by the military. I had to be in uniform at specific times. Sometimes I got to be a reenactor, and I was just a substitute. Coming upriver, it was really hard. So a lot of people did not want to be reenacting at that time. It was cold. It was miserable. So yes, this is a uniform that I did wear. I have other coats and stuff, but it's summertime and I didn't want to bring those coats down there. But I did volunteer as a reenactor coming upriver. My job there was actually to set up the Corps of Discovery. If you saw that mobile park, my job was to set that up, to tear it down, to move it from point A to point B. And again, if there was time, I was allowed to be a reenactor. Did that answer your question, sir?
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yes, when they took off from St. Louis and started to go up the Missouri, they knew that they were headed for Fort Mandan, and that was a course that was pretty well charted, and they had maps of that, I presume.
Yes, sir.
Then going west from Fort Mandan, and then all the way to the coast, they knew that there was Astoria, Oregon, there was a Columbia River, and some of that had been mapped. But I'm presuming that there was very little mapping or information between Fort Mandan and the Columbia River. How much could you characterize that more completely? As how much of a guide did he have or foreknowledge of the rivers and what he was going to be encountering between those 2 points?
Well, from Fort Mandan west, about 20 miles of the Columbia River, they did not know what was really out there.
There was nothing.
What they got was from the Hidatsas, the Mandans, the Arikara, or the Arikara, depends on who you talk to, on how you pronounce that name, was filling them in what they knew of that area. Because the Hadassahs mainly really came out here and did a lot of raiding parties, so they knew of this area. They knew of the different Native Americans that were out here. So Lewis, again, he was a very intelligent man, being a military officer, before he took his men out there, he was finding out what really laid ahead of him. And then he came out with a plan. He really didn't know by the people in the United States what lied past Fort Mandan. He knew as he was coming up the Missouri River where different Indian nations were. That's where he would send George Drouillard out, says, okay, we're 7 days into this, let's go find who's ever out here at this point, and then bring them back. George Drouillard had a difficult time because maybe he couldn't speak their language, but he had to be able to confront them and says, hey, come and have a council with my boss or with Captain Lewis. So from Camp Wood River all the way to Fort Mandan, they understood where they were. It was mapped out. The fur traders have been there. Then from Fort Mandan west, it was unknown except for what they got from the Native Americans. Did that answer your question, sir? And this is where Lewis was told about the Yellowstone River. He was told about that Elk River, that he can take that river and actually come days from the Missouri River. But it goes back into the executive order that Thomas Jefferson gave him and told Captain Lewis that he needed to follow the Missouri River to its headwaters. And maybe that's where Lewis said, hey, I'm just going to follow my superior all the way up the Missouri River.
But also auxiliary orders with that as well was to determine the farthest northern reaches of the Missouri River.
Yes, sir.
Watershed, too.
Yes, sir. And that's why he chose the Marias River, because he believed that the Marias River would extend past the 49th parallel, which that's where it's called Camp Disappointment, where he finally realized that actually the Marias River cuts back and actually starts in the Glacier National Park area. Now, if we would have went up the Milk River, maybe we would own a little bit more of the Canadian wilderness and more of the wheat belt. So who knows? That's kind of hard to say there, sir. But I hope I answered your question.
How much of the Glacier Park area did they see, if any?
They never even touched Glacier
never
Park
saw
area.
any of
They saw it, but they never really saw any of it. If you go up there, they made it about, I think it's 10 miles outside of Browning is the furthest that they actually made.
Wow.
So, and there's some
It's interesting that
monuments
you
up
think
there.
That's such a magnet when you see those mountains there from Browning looking west. It's so splendiferous compared to the other mountains to the south. You'd think they'd be interested in looking at something.
Well, I would think that he was interested in looking, but it was that time constraint. He knew where he needed to be to meet up with William Clark. So he didn't really have a lot of time to spare as he was coming back. He was on a time limit, and he needed to find out the most northern part. Once he found that the Marias River didn't go that far north, that was it, and he was ready to head back home. And then that's where he ran into the Blackfeet Indians. Yes, sir.
Except for one small glaring error of bad information that they got. They didn't realize that all they had to do was float all the rest of the way to the Pacific coast from Lolo.
Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir. I agree 100% with that, but they did not know that, yes. But if you look at those mountains, you'd probably, try, there's no way a river can get through there. So, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
There was one thing. I think they knew that Portland or the Columbia was at about the same latitude as Mandan.
Yes, sir.
And so they tried to stay on that line.
I agree 100% with you. Again, if you look back at those at the maps that they made, that would have been shown on there. So again, Lewis was going by his knowledge that he knew. That's why he came back up to the Travelers Rest, the Lolo area, and tried to cross there because he was thinking was the shortest route. So I agree 100% with you. Common knowledge would probably say that. Coming back, he knew a little bit differently, but he knew the route coming back, so I would imagine that he wanted to follow the same path coming back. And then he left the horses with the Nez Perce, so he had to come back and get his horses that he left there. Yes, sir.
Well, Sacagawea, the general navigator, both
by language as well as by direction as from her own childhood?
Actually, she wasn't really the navigator at all because they already knew their path. They made that choice at the Marias River that they were going to follow the Missouri River to its headwaters. What Sacagawea does, she recognizes a couple of land masses that was out here to say, we're in the area of my people. So she really did not direct them coming out here. She did have the knowledge of the area, the knowledge of the plants, and then her own accord on some of the encounters that she made when she saved some of the journals or some of the different parts of the expedition as Touchant Charbonneau was about ready to swamp the White Pirogue. So that's where Sacagawea actually contributes to the expedition. But actually guiding the expedition up here, no, they just followed the river coming up here. And then the other consequences was that Chief Camaway was now the chief of the Shoshone Indians of her people, and they were brothers and sisters.
They had a plan then, on their plan, to go to the Snake Indians without Sacagawea.
Right, and as soon as they done the portage around Great Falls and they were at the White Bear Island, they started looking for these Indians, for the Snake Indians, because they wanted to meet up with them. And it took all the way until August 13th actually to meet up with them. Yes, ma'am.
Back to I call her Sacagawea.
Okay, Sacagawea,
No,
yes.
that's okay. There are two pronunciations. But I think one of her main roles was that the fact that she was a woman, when the expedition would meet Indian tribes, they would not think that Lewis and Clark were coming to fight because they had a woman with them.
Right, the Assiniboines and the Blackfeet, the pagans, Indian tribes, they documented that they watched the expedition come upriver, and this was told by the elders during some of the powwows, that they followed them. They understood where they were coming and where they were going. Sacagawea was a sign to them that they were a friendly group of men coming out here, so they really didn't fear them. They feared the other Indian nations that was out here. And again, it goes back to they documented coming up on some of the camps that the Native Americans just left very abruptly. And if we talk to them, why they leave that very abruptly is because they go back because white men bring diseases with them. And they did not want to have a lot of interaction with the white men or with the men from the United States because they were already trading with the British. But they did document Sacagawea as being along the expedition, so they were a friendly expedition. So yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
What do you know about that Nez Perce woman that was supposed to have saved the expedition?
I'll kill her name, but it's like Wakikawea or so. Now she ran into some white men actually saved her when she was in the Minnesota area of the northern part of the United States. And then she ended up out there in Idaho, and she said that these white men treated her very nicely. So is that why the Nez Perce Indians, did not, kill the expedition? If they would have killed them all, then they would have had, probably the most firepower of any Indian nation out there at that point. So I don't know how far you want me to elaborate on that or not, but it just had to be coincidence that she was treated good by the white men, and so she told her chief, hey, let's treat these guys good. Yes, sir.
Of the 15 Harper Sperry's rifles, were they assigned to a person or were they handed out as needed?
Everybody back then, as they've been in the military, would have a weapon assigned to them. Who actually had the Harper Ferry, the 1803 Army rifles? Who knows the individuals? The 9 men in Kentucky probably brought their own long rifles out too. So again, no individual was handed this specific weapon. I'm not understanding where you're going with that, except for that.
Well, I just remember seeing up there was 15 rifles up there, and I just wondered how they were used, if that's all they had. But
Moses
were assigned each a rifle, and that was just brought along as extra. That's something else.
Oh no, they were. He took so many from Harper's Ferry, and at that point, he was believing that maybe a dozen to 15 or so members would be able to go on this expedition. But as soon as he hit the Missouri River, or as soon as he ran into the Mississippi River, he found out he needed more men. So again, those weapons were just handed out to the soldiers as they joined the expedition. And then if they brought their own, they would carry that weapon. The only weapon we know for sure who carried it was the air rifle of Captain Lewis's.
Have any of those rifles survived today? Are there any other?
The air rifle is believed to have survived, and it's in the Philadelphia Philosophical Society. But if we look back at how, again, the military operation was, when they came back into St. Louis, what Lewis did was sell all the items of the expedition and then pay the members of the expedition off that way. And then whatever notes he had to write from there. So nothing really survives from the expedition that we know of. There are some articles from Clark, from Lewis, and from the other soldiers that they actually carried and then handed down as family heirlooms. Okay, I'm going to have to say thank you very much. It was a nice evening. I'm sorry it got a little warm in here, but but thank you very much. Great questions out there. If you would like something that I handed out, I have no problem handing out some more stuff because it actually comes from you folks.
Hey, Sergeant?
I have maps. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Sergeant, for your
Thank you
service.
very much.
All right, well, thank you. Hey, these maps here are for your taking. All I ask is that you don't take the whole bundle. I have 2 bundles here, but if you want 2 or 3 of them your own, then you can take them. If you're a teacher or if you like to have another presentation, then I have some more information on that. My job is supposed to end come September 30th because that's when the new year rolls around. So anyway, thank you very much. I'll get you your set of maps.